Hello chess enthusiasts, my name is Miha and welcome to my chessrealm YouTube channel. Let's take a look at another interesting game from European Chess Championship 2021. This time between Jonas Bjerre and Tamás Bánusz. Very interesting game, as you will see. Let's see what happened in the game. Jonas Bjerre had white pieces and he started with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, and we have a Petrov defense or a Russian game, however you want to call it. So white captures on e5, now d6, knight goes back to f3, knight to e4, d4 and d5, and now bishop to d3, bishop to d6, pretty standard moves. So white castles kingside and black also plays c4, attacking this pawn on d5, and black defends with c6, c-pawn captures on d5 and c-pawn recaptures, and now knight to c3, double attack on knight on e4. So far so good, more or less everything according to the theory. So knight captures on c3, and now b-pawn recaptures. And now this bishop, who is protecting pawn on b7, goes to g4, pinning this knight on f3. And now, since b-pawn is not protected, white plays rook to b1, attacking this pawn on b7. We are in the 12th move, and I have found 300 games with this position, so this is Tabia, a well-trodden path. Alexei Shirov, for example, was a prominent player of this variation, and he played it against the top grandmasters, scoring good results. And now black plays according to the theory, knight to d7. You might think that pawn on b7 is for free, but if rook captures, then knight to b6, trapping the rook. Of course, white can protect the rook with bishop to a6, but then bishop to c8. And here black gains the exchange. So in the game, white plays h3, attacking bishop. Black has to decide what to do with the bishop, so bishop goes back to h5. Now bishop cannot go to c8 anymore, attacking the rook. So here maybe one of the options definitely is rook captures on b7. After rook is trapped, then bishop to a6, but then we have rook to c8, attacking this pawn on c3. Of course, white can defend with bishop to d2, but then knight to c4, attacking this bishop on c2. Well, queen has to stay on d1, protecting this knight on c3, because then white gets double pawned, so it's not like black doesn't get any counterplay for sacrificed pawn. Okay, so in the game, white played rook to b5, attacking pawn on d5, and now knight to b6, defending. And now white plays c4, attempting to play c5, forking both pieces. Well, rook is also targeting this bishop on h5, so black cannot simply capture on c4, attacking bishop, because bishop goes to h7 with check. After king recaptures, then rook to h5, king is forced to go back. Then knight to h4 is very unpleasant, because after queen to c2, eyeing on the black king, of course, knight can sacrifice on g6 if, for example, black tries to block with pawn. So this is very unpleasant position for black. So in the game, black plays knight to c4, and now rook captures on d5, attacking bishop on h5. And now black plays bishop to h2, discover attack on the rook. White captures with knight, also discover attack on bishop on h5. Well, of course, if bishop captures, then rook captures on d8, rook recaptures, and after rook captures on d1, then we have the two bishops versus rook. It's simply a winning position for white. Rook cannot even capture on d4, because then we have bishop to h7, discover attack on the rook. Okay, so in the game, black captures rook on d5, and now bishop to c4, attacking the queen. Again, bishop captures on d1, then bishop captures on d5. Well, this time it's only bishop and knight versus rook, but still this would be too much for black. So black has accepted the fact that he is going to have only rook for two pieces, but he wants to keep the queen to have more chess in the future. So queen captures on c4, and now queen captures on h5, and of course queen captures pawn on d4. So for a rook, white gets two pieces, but black has additional pawn. So let's see what happened later in the game. So knight goes to f3, attacking the queen, and queen goes to c4, attacking this defenseless pawn on a2, but now white plays knight to h4, threatening with knight to f5, preparing to sacrifice on g7, because then bishop to g2. This bishop would be deadly on this diagonal. So black tries to fortify his position. f6 was played, and now still knight to f5. You might think that black can play g6, forking both pieces. Well, not exactly. Then we have knight to e7 check. If king goes to h8, then knight to g6, forking both pieces. Of course, black cannot capture because pawn on h7 is pinned. If, however, king goes to g7, then queen to h6, king to f7, queen to h7, and now king has to go out. For example, king to e6, then we have, for example, rook to e1, king to d6, bishop to a3 check. There are more variations, but black is lost in all of them. For example, if king goes to d7, then knight to d5 check. If king goes to c8, then bishop to f8, threatening mate in 1, and after queen captures on d5, rook to e8 check, queen to d8, and then bishop to d6. Queen is pinned, so white is going to mate on c7 no matter what black does. Okay, let's go back to our game. So in the game, black plays rook to d8, now queen to f3, targeting this pawn on b7, so black defends with rook to d7, and now rook to e1. Now knight can check from either e7 or h6, so maybe the best option would be king to e8, removing the king, but black is greedy and grabs the pawn on a2. Now black gets to pass pawns, but black king is still in danger. Here in this position there was a elegant but maybe not the most obvious way to win. Bishop to h6 was the winning move, targeting this pawn on g7. Well, if black makes a random move, the bishop captures. Of course, if rook captures, knight captures, king captures, then we have queen to h7 check and grabbing also this rook on a8. If, however, black makes another random move, then queen to g4, threatening with knight to h6 checkmate. g5 doesn't help because after queen to g6, and is going to be mate in the next move. If, for example, black plays g5, then we have knight to e7 check. Of course, if king goes to f7, then queen to h5 checkmate. If king goes to h8, then queen to f6 checkmate. If, however, rook captures on e7, then of course rook recaptures. After queen captures this pawn, it's all over. And even after, if black tries to defend, then queen to e5 check. After king to h8, bishop to g7 checkmate. Now let's see what happens if black would capture bishop on h6, then knight recaptures. Now this king has 3 available squares. Well, the worst is, of course, if king goes to f8, then queen to f6 check. Queen can only defend. After queen to h8, queen to g8, queen to g8 checkmate. If king goes to h8, then queen to f6 check. Black can only defend with rook. And now rook on g7 is pinned, but rook also attacks this g2 square, so black only needs to place his queen on d5 with mating threat. So after that, rook to d1, threatening with mate on the last rank. And after maybe rook to e8, then rook goes to d8. Even after exchange of rooks, then black can only play rook to g8, and after that queen to f6, rook to g7, queen to f8, rook to g8, and now knight to f7. King cannot go anywhere, and the only option for black is to sacrifice the queen for the knight. After queen recaptures, we have queen versus rook. Okay, black has 2 additional pawns, but white can easily stop them later that with pawn push, simply winning. And the best option, of course, would be king to g7, but after that queen to g4, check, also attacking rook on d7. After king captures knight, then queen captures rook. And now there are many ways to convert this advantage into victory, since king is left in the open. I don't know, maybe rook to f8, after that rook to d7, attacking pawn on h7, maybe queen to j8 defending, but then the idea is to push these pawns to create a mating net, so I don't know, maybe after rook to d8, then queen to f6, rook to f8, then maybe queen to f4 check, king to h5, then white starts eating pawns, also with deadly mating threats. So this is simply a winning position for white. Okay, so in the game white doesn't play bishop to h6. In the game white played bishop to a3, preparing to deploy it on e7, because white expects that rook some when will come to d8. And now black plays king to h8, moving the king away from the check, and now h4, pushing the pawn towards the king, and now rook from the last rank goes to d8, and now bishop to e7, attacking the rook. Well, of course, if rook goes to e8, then queen to g4, threatening with mate. For example, if black defends, then white simply pushes pawn, and if black tries to stop it, then knight goes to h6, attacking the queen and also the rook. Even if black plays queen to d5, then knight to f7 check. After queen captures, then queen captures rook. Decisive advantage for white. If, for example, in this position rook goes to g8, then we have this knight to d6 with threat of knight to f7 with smothered mate, so very unpleasant threat here. Black can only sacrifice his rook. So in the game black plays queen to d2, counter attack on white rook. So white plays rook to e2, queen to c1, and now king to h2, and now rook goes to g8. You might wonder why not play knight to d6, threatening with knight to f7. Well, in this case queen goes to c7, and now knight on d6 is pinned, and here white is losing. So in the game white plays h5, preparing to strike on h6. Well, that would be very unpleasant, so black plays h6, stopping h-pawn, and now white plays knight to h4, preparing to strike on a g6. Well, if this happens, for example, if black plays a random move, then knight to g6 check, king to h7, and now queen to f5. First of all, attacking rook on h7, black removes the rook, then knight to f8 check, king to h8, and queen to h7 checkmate. So black plays rook to d1. Now knight to g6 doesn't work anymore, because after knight to g6 check, king to h7, queen to f5, then we have rook to h1 check, and king has to go to g3, and then we have queen to g5. Double attack on king and the queen, forcing the exchange of queens. Well, after that these two passed pawns would be deadly, so it's hard to predict what would be the outcome after that. So in the game white plays g3. Now h1 square is protected. Maybe one of the options would be rook to e8, pinning this bishop on e7. But here black makes a fatal blunder. Queen to g5 was played. And now we have a stunning response from white. Rook to e5, attacking the queen. Well, of course, if pawn captures rook, then simply bishop captures queen after pawn recaptures, then knight to g6 check, king to h7, queen to f5, threatening with mate, even after rook to d8. Then we have this knight on e5 check, for example king to h8, and then we have h6. Now if black captures, queen to f6 check, king to g8, queen to f7, king to h8, and knight to g6. So black is lost here in all variations. If however queen captures rook, then we have knight to g6, double attack on king and the queen. After king to h7, then knight to f5. And white is also attacking this rook on d1, so this is a winning position for white. So in the game, black plays queen to c1, and now white plays bishop to f6. Of course, black cannot capture because after queen to f6, we have mate in a couple of moves. If rook to g7, then rook to e8, king to h7, queen to f5. Black can only play rook to g6, after that queen to g6 checkmate. If however black plays king to h7, then rook to e7, after rook to g7, queen to g7 checkmate. So in the game, black plays rook to e1, trying to trade the rooks. Well, white captures on e1, queen to e1, but now the end is near. White played a move and black resigned. It's not so obvious, so don't worry if you haven't found it. White played queen to f4, targeting this h6 pawn. Well, of course, if black makes a random move, it's queen to h6 checkmate because pawn on g7 is pinned. If black captures, bishop on f6, still queen to h6 checkmate. If black tries to defend with queen to b1, then queen to h6 check, queen to queen to h7, and now knight to g6 checkmate. If black tries to make a room for his king, then still queen to h6 check, king to g8, and queen to g7 checkmate. And realizing his hopeless position here, Tamás Bánusz resigned the game. So I hope you like this game and that you have learned something from it. If you have any questions, my email is below in the description. Of course, I invite you to visit my Instagram page. That's it for now, and see you soon.